Welcome to my presentation about my great-grandfather, Gunnar Anderson, Company B of the 355th Infantry 89th Division. Gunnar Anderson was born in Selbu, Norway. His last name was originally Chesnes, but he changed to Anderson when he arrived in the United States. He was born on May 25, 1889 in Selbu, Norway. His parents were Arnt Chesnes and Sigrid Nilsladder Sessing. His siblings were older brother Ole Chesnes and Nils Chesnes. This is the first known photo of Gunnar and his family, as we see Gunnar there, estimated around age 10 there in the center. He is surrounded by his brothers on the sides and his parents in front. This is the Selbu church where Gunnar attended and was baptized and confirmed as a child. It was constructed in 1150 AD. Gunnar grew up in the farthest section of Selbu, Norway. And what's noteworthy about this photo is we see the center houses where Gunnar grew up as a child. The house on the far left is is the house that Gunnar's father built in anticipation that he would return after the war, which he never did. Gunnar had numerous decisions to leave Norway, the primary being that his eldest brother inherited the farm, and his other brother had already left for the United States, and by this time millions of immigrants had already entered the United States. He left the port of Trondheim, Norway, with two traffic companions, those being Essen Gilseth and Ole Chesnes. He took two ships to get there, the first being the Tasso II and the second being the SS Link Champlain. After landing in Quebec, he took the train across Canada and arrived in Northport, Washington on May 17, 1910, nearly a full month after leaving Selbu. He was required to renounce fidelity to King Haakon VII of Norway and promised that he was not a polygamist or an anarchist. He eventually settled in the La Crosse, Washington area with the Slind family, who's also from Selbu. He eventually arrives in the Albany, South Dakota area for work in about 1915. He is drafted on April 20th, 1918, and told to report to local board at Milbank, South Dakota on April 26, 1918 at 1 p.m. This is a photo of Gunnar and his draft class, and an article listing him and those he is drafted with on the right. He began basic training at Camp Funston, Kansas, which had nicknames of the Middle West Division and the Rolling W Division. Built in 1917, is now home to Fort Riley and little of the camp remains. What's noteworthy about this photo is we see the civilians getting off the train still in their civilian clothes, and those on the right already in their military uniforms. He was at Camp Funston for about 3 weeks from about May 1st to May 21st, until his division left to New York State in further preparation across the Atlantic. Gunnar initially served in Company B in the 164th Depot Brigade, which was a training unit. After basic training, he was assigned to Company B of the 355th Infantry. The Spanish flu was thought to have originated in Haskell County, Kansas, which is just across the border of Colorado. It then followed draftees to Camp Funston, where it found lots of soldiers living in cramped conditions. The flu was thought to have killed between 20 million people and 100 million people. This is compared to 10 million military personnel deaths, about 7 million civilian deaths. About 650,000 Americans lost their lives alone due to the Spanish flu. There's no indication that Gunnar ever contracted the Spanish flu. Nearly half of all military deaths during the war were due to disease, and many of the cases mushroomed at Camp Funston and spread to other camps nearby. Essen Gilseth, one of Gunnar's traveling companions when he left Selbu, dies of the Spanish flu in France. The 89th Division left on a sunny day from New York to Europe on June 4, 1918, and arrived in Liverpool on June 16th for a brief stay. Below is an example of dazzle painting, which was meant to confuse the enemy, not necessarily to conceal the ship. Here we see the Holmes 40 Chevrolet 8 boxcar, which had the emblem 40/8 stenciled on the sides, which meant that it could either carry 40 men or 8 horses. The 89th Division is nearing the front in this photo. It was the first time troops were bused to the front. Here we see the Western Front, which stretched about 480 miles all the way from the English Channel to Switzerland. The St.Mihiel salient posed a threat to the French lines and needed to be reduced. We see the town of Fleury on the bottom corner, and immediately left is the 89th Division. Immediately left of the 89th Division is the 1st and 42nd Divisions, which we will speak about later. There were numerous gas attacks during the war, and Gunner was a part of one August 7th through 8th. There were many casualties because at the time soldiers were told to hold their ground, which was later re-evaluated because those gassing the area could not occupy, so thus it was pointless to defend. Stretcher bearers wore gloves to protect their hands from gas-infected clothing. The wounded were then transported to hospitals near Toul, France. Many mistakes were made during the gas attacks, as I mentioned earlier, holding their ground. As indicated by the green section, that is where the gas area was, and on the top right corner is the town of Fleury, where Gundar was positioned. Just north of the town of Fleury was Bois-de-Montmartre, which was a heavily forested area which the 89th Division had to fight through. The St.Mihiel offensive began by firing 1 million shells at 1 a.m. on September 12, 1918, and persisted for 4 hours. This would mean 4,000 artillery pieces firing once a minute for 4 continuous hours, and at 5 a.m., troops go over the top. We see the advancement of Gundar in the 89th Division as indicated by the blue arrows, and near the red X near the town of Zambis, France, closely indicates where Gundar was wounded. It is estimated that 9 million horses were killed during the war, and in their absence, dogs were used to send messages on the battlefield and haul small loads. Terrible traffic jams occurred during the front, mostly due to the heavy rains the first 2 days, and those bringing artillery to the front and those bringing the wounded back. This is not a letter of Gundar, but it's interesting to take note because the letter says, "This is where your boy almost got his," and this is as close as we can locate where Gundar was wounded. Here we see the town of Fleury today on the bottom 3 photos. On the top left is a destroyed church during the war, and on the bottom right is a memorial to those who fought during the St.Mihiel offensive. Gundar is wounded on September 14, 1918, as he is aiming his rifle in this trench. He's hit in both the left and right elbow, and even a third bullet creased his helmet. Afterwards, he is victim to a hand grenade explosion which tore away part of his left tricep, leaving him permanently disabled. He's initially treated at the front, but is moved to base hospital number 13, over 400 miles away in Limoges, France. He's then shipped back to the United States, where he convalesced at Camp Grant, just west of Chicago. The wounded were first treated at the scene during the war, and then moved back to field hospitals, possibly regional hospitals, and then base hospitals spread out around the country. Here we see Grand Base Hospital 13 in Limoges, France, which was a series of wooden structures which do not exist today. On the postcard is indicated by the black X as where Base Hospital 13 was during that time. This is a photo of Limoges, France today, and Base Hospital 13 would be just down that road. Here's a letter from Gundar's father in Norway acknowledging the fact that his son was wounded and he was distraught. As I mentioned earlier, he built the extra section of the house in anticipation that Gundar would return, which he never did. Gundar was discharged on May 8, 1919 at Camp Grant, Illinois. His wounds were listed as gash right and left arm, however his character was listed as excellent. This is Gunnar Anderson's honor roll in which he received for his participation in the war and the United States victory. Here we see the Columbia poster. The idea of the Purple Heart was initiated by George Washington in 1782 and initially known as the Badge of Military Merit. For unknown reasons, it was not awarded again during the war, and those who were wounded had to prove that they were wounded in order to receive it. The current design of disabled American veterans is based on the Columbia poster. The medals he received were the Purple Heart, the Victory Medal, and the Disabled American Veterans Medal. He returned home to marry Gudrun Vick on October 2, 1919. Despite being discharged on May 8th, he still wears his uniform to his wedding, possibly the only suit he had. He and Gudrun had 5 children, most notably being my grandfather Alvin in 1925. New technologies during the war were both the airplane and strategic bombing. The airplane was primarily used for reconnaissance, in other words, to spot the position of the enemy. Strategic bombing was meant to attack the civilians of the enemy, which would in turn hurt the enemy. Here we see Colonel George S. Patton, who would become an influential general in World War II. He commanded 2 tank battalions, which were immediately left of the Gundar and the 89th. The first American use of the tank was during the St.Mihiel offensive. However, it was of limited value due to the heavy rains the first few days. Chlorine gas was especially menacing because it would settle in low-lying areas, thus being the trenches. Artillery improvements during the war were the most lethal weapons of the war. Improvements with hydraulic recoil allowed for artillery pieces to fire from the same position without being repositioned. Improvements with metallurgy allowed for larger weapons to be produced. The machine gun met the trenches, which caused large slaughter. In order to survive, soldiers dug foxholes in the ground and then connected those to make trenches, which then led to great stalemate during the war. Now we are going to speak about notable members of Company B of the 355th. Here we see Marciano Serna, who was born in Chihuahua, Mexico. Despite being found to be a legal alien while in France, he declined discharge. In September 1918, he found a wounded German to an underground bunker. He then threw a grenade into the bunker and was stunned when 24 Germans came out with their hands up in surrender. John Warmbliss was killed on action on September 19, 1918, as part of the St.Mihiel offensive. There is a VFW in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, named after him. Chauncey Porter, on September 12, 1918, single-handedly charged a machine gun alone with only an automatic pistol, killed one man, captured another, and drove the remainder of the enemy platoon back along the trench, enabling his platoon to advance. Glenn M. Reed was killed on September 13, 1918, as he voluntarily left shelter and passed through a heavy enemy barrage to assist a wounded comrade. It is conceivable that he did come to the aid of my great-grandfather, as many reports listed him wounded on the 13th of September and others on the 14th. John Brinda showed extraordinary heroism in action on September 12, 1918. Without awaiting orders, he went forward against a concealed enemy machine gun which was holding up his platoon, killed the gunner, and captured 4 men, enabling his platoon to advance. Now we see the graves and portraits of Company B, 355th Infantry, 89th Division. Now we see the St.Mihiel American Cemetery, which is the final resting place of more than 4,000 American soldiers, including many from Gunner's Infantry. We'd like to thank all veterans on today's Memorial Day. We'd especially like to thank all of you for listening to my presentation about my great-grandfather and his World War I experiences.